Hi everybody, Andrew Cuneo here with another deck tech. This time it's going to be a historic ramp deck. The previous video I posted was about an alchemy deck that was trying to take advantage of this card, Settle the Wilds. And I've been pretty impressed by it in alchemy, enough so that it made me want to try it in historic because obviously with the bigger card pool, there's a wider variety of things you can get with the seek aspect of this card. So that's what this deck is going to be. It's trying to take advantage of all the good stuff you can seek for in historic while you're ramping. So I guess let's start with the cheap cards. For Llanowar Elves, I wasn't 100% sure I wanted to play Llanowar Elves in this deck. They're so good if you play them, they live, but it is a point in your ramping that it's pretty easy for most decks to interact with. But I decided to go ahead and play them because this is really one of the only productive things you can do on turn one. And in historic, you really want to start doing things on turn one in a lot of the games. It's too slow if you're waiting till turn two sometimes. Certainly, you don't want to keep very many hands on the draw where you don't do anything until turn three. So that's why I went with the Llanowar Elves. And then I've got 2 copies of Relic of Progenitus. This deck does not use the graveyard at all, so the Relic does not get in the way of what you're doing at all. I like playing Graveyard Hate in Historic, especially in the main deck. Most people in Historic, if they're planning to use the graveyard, they'll have a plan where they're pretty reliant on the graveyard in game one, and then they'll have the ability to sideboard into a deck that is less reliant on the graveyard in games 2 and 3. So if you're planning to use Graveyard Hate, the best time to do it is honestly in game one. Obviously, if this is a good card against their main deck, I'm just going to leave it in my deck after sideboarding, and presumably they'll have a plan that will make it less good. But it's just a really strong card. If you get primarily against Is It Phoenix or against a Dreadhorde Arcanist deck, those are the spots I think where it really shines. And also once we get into the more expensive cards, there is a lot of vulnerability to a 6-point Unholy Heat, like a fully deliriumed Unholy Heat in this deck. So it's nice to potentially be able to shut that off. It'll make a lot of my more expensive cards much more durable against probably the premier removal spell in the format. Then we've got 4 copies of Into the North. This is kind of an oddball card that it was added to Historic a while ago in one of the Historic anthologies, I believe. So you search a library for a snow land, put it onto the battlefield tab. So this is a rampant growth style card, which they have not printed a new one of these really in a long time because they're kind of considered to be overpowered. There's Emergence Sequence, but that doesn't just put a land into play, it puts your land into play as a creature, so it's very easy to kill. This just, you go in and get a land, and it's even better. You can get any snow land, not just snow basics. So we had to look at what are the good snow lands to play. It turns out Scrying Sheets has not been added to Arena, and I'm playing monocolor, so I don't want any of the snow dual lands, but there's a friend, Faceless Haven. It's the nerfed version of Faceless Haven. It only becomes a 3/3, but it's still really powerful if your Rampant Growth variant is just going and getting a creature land, even if it's not the greatest creature land ever. Actually, I have 2 copies of Faceless Haven because I thought that in some matchups you'd actually potentially want to get 2 of them. So that's why there's 2 in the deck. Only 2 Explorers, which might seem like a weird number of Explorers to put in a deck, but Explorer is one of those cards that, especially if it's going to be your premier ramped card on turn 2, you really have to play a super high land count. And given that this deck is playing cards like Into the North and Settle the Wilds, you really can't play a high enough land count for it to be great. So right now this deck has 25 real lands and 1 Kazandu Mammoth. Kazandu Mammoth does work with Explore. You can put it into play as a Kazandu Valley after casting Explore. So we've got 26 lands that are going to be able to take advantage of the Explorer, which that's a little bit on the light side, but it's also, we're only playing 2 copies of Explorer. there's going to be other options to play on turn 2 in hands that are light on lands. But I think you definitely, with this deck, you want to ramp on turn 1 or 2 every single game. So between the Llanowar Elves, the Into the Norths, the Explorers, and the Mindstone, which we're going to get to in a second, we've got 14 ways to ramp on turn 2, which I think that's pretty reliable. So, like I said, 4 Mindstones. I think Mindstone is the better way to ramp in this deck than Explorer, because you're not really that concerned about specific colored mana sources. This is just a mono green deck. It does have a fair amount of colorless mana in it, but I'm only trying to cast double green cards, and there's a ton of green sources in the deck. So Mindstone is really nice in that you ramp early and then eventually you draw a card. Obviously, if you could guarantee that Explorer would always have the second land to play, that would make it a better card than Mindstone. But Explorer is just not quite as reliable, I would say. So that's why there's 4 Mindstones, only 2 Explorers. 2 Voracious Hydras. This is just kind of a catch-all card. In a ramp deck, this scales with how much you ramp. It also gives you a way to interact with your opponent's creatures, which mono green is sort of lacking if you don't play a card like this. And also, just in a ramp deck, this spell, it's always going to be something you can do on curve for whatever turn you happen to be on. I mean, you're not going to play it on turn 2 as an 0-1, but once you get to 3 or more mana, this is always a card that you're going to be able to play to utilize all your mana if that's what you're looking to do on a turn. Also, there's some creatures in Historic that it's really annoying if you can't kill them, like a Thalia, an Esper Sentinel, Core Spirit Dancer, Mayhem Devil. There's a lot of creatures that can be really important to kill. That's why I've got Voracious Hydras to hopefully pick those off. Moving on to the 3 mana cards, there's Settle the Wilds, like I said. This is kind of the impetus behind the deck. I think it's an easy 4 of. Then there's 1 Kazandu Mammoth, which probably looks pretty weird in a ramp deck. Like, why do you want a land that's going to come into play tapped? Why do you want this sort of beatdown creature? The answer is because of Llanowar Elves. So if you think about it, if you go turn 1 Llanowar Elves, turn 2, you're going to play your second land. If the ramp spell you can afford to play at that point is Settle the Wilds, you're going to settle, you'll get your third land, you'll seek for a 3 CMC card, and you won't find anything unless you have Kazandu Mammoth in your deck. That's why the Kazandu Mammoth's there. There weren't any other options at 3 mana that I thought were particularly appealing. I considered like Scoot Swarm or maybe Asika, but both of those cards I just think were too bad. Kazandu Mammoth, you're mostly going to play it as a land if you draw it. If you settle it, if you play Settle and you seek into it, you're still probably going to play it as a land, but you do have the option to play it as a 3/3. It's just making sure you get full value if you're playing Settle on turn 2. That's why it's there. Also, just in this deck, you can sometimes play it on turn 2 or turn 3, with the Llanowar Elf, or just play it on turn 3. And then you wind up ramping on subsequent turns, and it'll attack as a 7/7 some of the time. So it's not completely useless to play it as a Kazandu Mammoth. All right, let's get to the more interesting part of how to build this deck, which is what are all of the settle targets once you go beyond 3. So at 4 mana, I've decided to go with Hedron Archive. I'm only playing 2 Hedron Archives. I don't think that it's not like in Alchemy, where with Key to the Archive, you kind of always want to play it on turn 4 if you can in a lot of matchups. I think Hedron Archive is a little bit less appealing. And obviously I could be playing Key to the Archive, but I think the Hedron Archive is worse in this deck than the Hedron Archive is. This isn't a kind of controlling deck, so the random removal spells you're getting off Key to the Archive aren't particularly good. They don't really fit into what the rest of your deck is trying to do. The same thing with like a card like Counterspell. I mean, it'd be nice sometimes to get it, but it's always going to find you a card that's kind of off theme for what you're trying to do. I think Hedron Archive is the better way to ramp. Also, this deck does spend 2 colorless mana either on Mind Stones or Relic of Progenitus, so you are going to sometimes tap it 4 mana the turn you play it, which that certainly matters. Also, there can be more complicated turns later on in the game where you're going to play it and then tap it for 2 mana, and then play an even more expensive card. That's just going to depend on how many lands you have. But the fact that this taps for mana the turn that you put it into play does matter a lot in this deck. One other option that you could explore if you're interested in it is this copy of Karn the Great Creator. So you could settle and have your 4 mana play be Karn the Great Creator, and then, you know, build a Karn sideboard. That's not what I chose to do, but that might be an area that people are interested in exploring if you're a fan of this card. I'm not a huge fan of this card. That's kind of why I didn't do it. So I think that right now I'm of the opinion Hedron Archive's the best. If you wanted to try something else, maybe Karn, the Great Creator, maybe Key to the Archive. I think that those are the 3 reasonable options. Other than that, you can get a card like Questing Beast or something, but I don't think that's a very appropriate card for the main deck of this deck. At 5 mana, I've chosen to go with Nissa, Who Shakes the World. Nissa, Who Shakes the World is a great card. If you didn't play when it was legal in Standard, or you just haven't played with it in a while, you may not realize just how ridiculous of a card this is. This card is really, really strong. It hasn't really had a deck that it made sense to play it in Historic, but I think this could be the deck that really puts it back on the map in Historic. So that's why I've chosen to go with Nissa. There are other options you could consider. So one of them is Golos, which Golos does push you into building the deck a little bit differently. I had a Golos build that I tried for a while, and I think Golos just isn't as good of a card as Nissa. But it does allow you to do some kind of cool things, like you can play with a package of a wide variety of lands to go tutor for. So you could have like Scavenger Grounds in your deck. I have a Blast Zone. You would have a Blast Zone in a Golos build. You'd have Cascading Cataracts, World Tree. There's also, you know, Lair of the Hydra that's in this deck. You can go get that. There's a lot of good options for lands to get with Golos. I think the problem, though, is just 5 mana. You get a 3/5 in a land. That's a little bit underwhelming in Historic. Nissa produces a much, much more aggressive clock and also just ramps you much faster. So that's why I've gone with Nissa. Another option you could consider, which I don't think is better than either of these, would just be Elder Gargaroth. There are some decks in Historic that really struggle to beat an Elder Gargaroth, but this is like, Elder Gargaroth I think is the poster child for the problem with playing 5-drops in Historic that just die to Unholy Heat. Like, you're just asking for this to die to Unholy Heat. Obviously, Nissa also dies to Unholy Heat, but you're at least going to get to plus it once, so you're going to get to untap a land and make it into a 3/3, so you'll get value. And if you're playing Nissa when you've got more than just 5 mana in play, you might be able to play Nissa, untap a land, and then you know have access to 4 mana or more mana and play a second spell. So you can fight through the Unholy Heat with Nissa far more effectively than you would be able to with Elder Gargaroth. Also, like I said at the beginning, Relic of Progenitus is a way to kind of solve this Unholy Heat problem. If you happen to have it in play, you can make it so that they just can't even kill your Nissa potentially. So that's nice. I think those are the only 5-drops you should really be considering. And I've gone with Nissa. I think it's just the best card in a vacuum, and that's the main reason that I've gone with that choice. All right, moving on to the 6-drops, we've got 2 copies of Kogla the Titan Ape, which this is just a way to get some more interaction with creatures in the deck. Also, it has this ability that when it attacks, you can destroy an artifact or enchantment, which is potentially going to matter in games against like a cat oven deck where you can get their oven, you could get their trail of crumbs, something like that. It also has this ability that you can return a human to your hand to give it indestructible at the end of turn. This deck doesn't have any humans in it, but it does have 2 Faceless Havens, so you can use that final ability. It's really awkward to use. One of the reasons it's awkward is the way that Nissa works is not ideal with snow mana. So when Nissa's in play, your Snow-Covered Forests tap for 1 snow mana, and 1 regular green mana. So in order to animate a Faceless Haven, you're still going to have to tap 3 snow-covered lands. But beyond the Faceless Haven, you need 4 snow-covered lands to turn Faceless Haven into a creature that can be involved in combat. If you're trying to save Kogla, you do float additional green mana if you have Nissa in play with the Kogla and a Faceless Haven. So it might be, it's a little bit more palatable to do that than it might seem initially, but that's a really, really minor interaction of the deck. That's not the reason that it's in the deck. It's in the deck to kill your opponent's creatures, basically. There are some other options you could consider on 6 mana. So one of them is the Ravenwald Hydra, which goes and seeks a land. This is kind of like another version of Golos. It does give you a giant reach creature, which could be nice if you're particularly interested in blocking, Arclight, Phoenix type cards. And also this can scale beyond 6 toughness, so it can get out of Unholy Heat range. But it just doesn't provide as much impact as Kogla does the turn it comes down. When I was playing with Golos, I had this in my deck as well because I had more of a toolbox package of lands to go get. Once I switched to Nissa, I wanted to just have a lot of forests in my deck. So I stopped playing with Ravenwald Hydra. And I've been impressed with Kogla. This is the build that I prefer right now, but you could certainly go back to trying the Hydra. There's a couple other 6-drops that are in the sideboard that I'll get to when we get to the sideboard, that they serve very specific purposes. At 7 mana, we've got 1 copy of Hornet Queen. Hornet Queen is really strong in a couple of matchups, particularly against like an Arclight Phoenix deck, or if you're against one of those like red-black Dreadhorde Arcanist decks. Basically decks that they're trying to attack you and they don't have sweepers. That's where the Hornet Queen is going to shine. There are a lot of other matchups where Hornet Queen's not a very good card. Like if you're playing against somebody who has Anger of the Gods in their deck or Day of Judgment, something like that, it's really just not going to do very much realistically. So this is another one of the cards that there's a different 7-drop you can swap in, and we'll get to when we get to the sideboard. At 8 mana, we've got everyone's favorite card from Historic Brawl. It's Ugin, the Spirit Dragon. Ugin is a card that I've never liked very much, but in a deck that's really trying to ramp hard, it is a powerful card to put into play. And it's a card that a lot of decks in Historic just are not at all prepared to answer, because this kind of card hasn't been on the map at all lately. I think this is very clearly the best 8 you can get. I did try one other 8 for a little while in either the main deck or the sideboard. So this seems like it'd be fun against Arclight Phoenix, because realistically they probably couldn't kill you if they can't get it off the board. The problem with this card, though, is Ether Gust, and to a lesser extent Brazen Borrower. Putting an 8-mana card into your deck that's just an 8-mana green card that not only can they gust it when it's on the stack, but if they just have a gust in their hand and they get to untap and cast the Ether Gust, they still get full value on, well, I guess you get the 5/5 green worm in that case, but you're still just going to die to the flyers. So this card seems like it might be cool, but it's just way too bad against Ether Gust. So that's why I don't have that one anymore. Then I've got a single 10-mana card, Ulamog, to go get. This one, I'm not 100% sold that you really need your curve to go up to 10 to get this, but it's not the worst card in the world. I don't know how many games it's really going to come up where you settle into it. I think in a lot of matchups, it's a card you can safely board out. The reason I still have it in my main deck is I want to have the ability to get it against the Cat Oven deck specifically, because I think, it can end the game against the Cat Oven deck fairly quickly. So that is the main deck. I guess we didn't talk about the lands. So I've got 1 Blast Zone as an oddball land. This is basically an anti-Cat Oven card. You can also kill Dragon's Rage Channeler with it, which a lot of decks have. And it gives you a little bit more ability to interact with like a Core Spirit Dancer style deck, even though this is a really awkward way to kill a Core Spirit Dancer, but it is a way to do it at least. Then a lot of Snow-Covered Forest because we're a Nissa deck. 2 Faceless Havens, like I said, it's because you want to have the option of getting them within to the north. Then we've got these 2 lands, 2 non-Snow-Covered Forest lands, 2 Castle Garenbrigs, which they obviously are just great if you're planning to play expensive creatures. It works with Kogla, Hornet Queen, and Ulamog. And 2 Lair of the Hydras, which Lair of the Hydra was not legal in Standard when Nissa was, so I've never had these 2 in a deck together, at least not before trying this deck. The Lair of the Hydra gets absolutely gigantic if you have a Nissa in play. So I think that this is a pretty clear inclusion in a ramp deck. You're going to be able to turn this thing into a 10-10 in a surprising number of games. So I think that's one you can pretty happily include. There's certainly room to tinker with these lands some. You might prefer to play like a Scavenger Grounds over a Blast Zone, or you might want a Field of Ruin. You might prefer to just play another green land, like another Castle Garenbrig or Lair of the Hydra. A lot of that's going to depend on what particular decks you're trying to target with your build, and also it's going to depend on what expensive cards you've chosen to include in your deck. Because like we went over when we were talking about, Golos versus Ulvenwald Hydra versus Nissa, how you make those decisions 100% has to affect what mix of lands you play. There's no reason to play this many Snow-Covered Forests if you're not playing Nissa, for sure. Let's take a look at the sideboard. So to start, let's go over the swaps for Settle the Wild. So against a Teferi deck, Kogla has almost no targets to fight. We've got 2 Carnage Tyrants to bring in that kind of matchup, so that would be a straight swap. Against a Heliod deck that's trying to do the infinite life combo by putting counters on the Scurry Oak, we've got 1 Vorinclex Monstrous Raider. So this is one you would certainly board in. I'm not 100% sure how I would board in that matchup, because Kogla is also actually a pretty reasonable card in that matchup. I haven't gotten to play that matchup yet, so I'm not sure if you want to just only have Vorinclex, or you might want to just have a mix of Vorinclex and Koglas and just accept that your settle's going to be a little bit random there. 1 Cragplate Baloth as a 7-drop to board in against Teferi decks, where obviously Hornet Queen is pretty weak against somebody who's going to have sweepers in their deck and also potentially counters. So Cragplate Baloth can't be countered for 7 mana. That's nice. And also it pretty conveniently can just come down and kill a 5 mana Teferi if they just play a 5 mana Teferi and plus it. So that's great. 1 copy of Pelakka Wurm as a different 7-drop to swap in if you want the ability to gain life. So against like a burn deck, you would do this. I've also been doing this against the Cat Oven decks to swap Pelakka Wurm in for Hornet Queen. Hornet Queen's kind of weak against Mayhem Devil, and having some life gain against the Cat Oven decks is certainly a nice option. I think, then there's also, I've got 2 Questing Beasts in my deck right now, which are replacement, or they're additional 4 mana cards. I'm not sure if I would take the Hedron Archives out. These are against Teferi Planeswalker style decks. So this is a new deck. I haven't exactly worked out how I'm going to sideboard in every matchup, but that's the purpose of the Questing Beasts, is to be able to pressure Teferis and Narsets. 2 more Voracious Hydras. These are things you would board in just against annoying creature decks. So if you're playing against like a white weenie deck with Thalia, you'd want to board them in. If you're playing against that Heliod deck where you want to get their Soul Warden off the board, or you want to get their Trelasara off the board, you'd board in your Voracious Hydras there. Also against Core Spirit Dancer decks. So basically any deck that has small creatures that you really want to kill because they're going to, potentially combo off and kill you with them. Then we've got 1 Scavenging Ooze, 1 Grafdigger's Cage. This is just some additional graveyard hate. I'm kind of a fan of playing exactly 1 copy of Grafdigger's Cage a lot of the time, Most decks you really can't afford to have draws where in post-sideboard games where you draw multiple Grafdigger's cages, because, like I said, most people's historic decks, they plan on going from a game one deck that's really reliant on their graveyard working to a deck that is only using the graveyard somewhat. So if you're boarding in Cage, they will have boarded out some amount of the stuff that the Cage is going to stop. So Cage just becomes less effective. And certainly given that I have main deck Relics, I didn't feel like I needed that many Cages. Cage also hits some other things, like it hits Muxus and it hits Collected Company. If you're particularly concerned about beating Muxus, I think you'd want to have more Cages in your sideboard. And then Scavenging Ooze is just kind of a flexible anti-graveyard card that's not embarrassing if it turns out they've boarded away from a deck that uses the graveyard heavily. Also, it's another way to gain life if you play against a red burn deck. One copy of Weather the Storm, which is certainly just an anti-burn card. I don't know how much burn there really is going to be on the ladder, realistically. This is one that if you want to prepare to beat burn, you should have more copies of it. If you want to ignore burn, you should just ignore it. Or, not play with it. 2 copies of Ratchet Bomb. This is an oddball card. So the main reason this is in my sideboard is specifically the Indomitable Creativity decks that are looking to turn their crab tokens and their treasure tokens into Sarah's emissaries. The way that deck works is they're planning to creativity away 0 CMC permanents. So a Ratchet Bomb can effectively just counter an Indomitable Creativity. So that is why that is in the sideboard. You could also obviously board it in against a white weenie deck if they had a ton of 1-drops. You could board it in against a Core Spirit Dancer Aura deck. It might be a little bit too slow on the draw in that matchup, but I think in the play, it's going to be a good card for you. So that's the sideboard, and I'm excited about this deck. I think it's got actual potential to be a competitive Historic deck. And Historic is such a high power level format that coming up with a newish archetype that might actually be competitive is really hard to do. And I think this deck might actually achieve that. So let's go ahead and watch it in some games. Perfectly reasonable hand. Obviously, I'm looking for something to ramp into, but you'd much rather start with a hand of lands and ramp than a hand of lands and expensive cards and no ramp. This is probably a Heliod combo deck, which Ugin is going to be very effective against their deck, assuming I get to live to the point that I can untap with it. So should I play this elf? I think I don't need to play it. Might want to charge my Blast Zone up. The only awkward thing that could happen here is if they just pass and leave up company mana. Yeah. I think I'm just going to try to bait them into companying, and then I'll sweep whatever they get with the Ugin. I don't think there's... I guess I die here if... Well, no, I don't die even if they hit a Scurry Oak, because I can Blast Zone for 2 to get the Innkeeper off the board. So I think that that was a completely safe play. So as long as it has 10 or more counters it as indestructible, I might want to Blast Zone this thing away. So they're going to get to do the combo. I should have sacked my Mind Stone. Oh man, I really should have sacked my Mind Stone because I'm going to be forced to chump with a Llanowar Elf on the Lunarch Veteran. Oh no, I'm not, because they only have one way to gain life, so they can't make the Lunarch Veteran infinitely large. In paper, if we were playing, I'd have to be concerned with how can my deck beat infinite life, because they could get to a, you know, they could make their life total 100 million here or something. On Arena, people aren't actually going to do that, but it doesn't matter because the one Ulamog I have in my deck is enough to beat infinite life. As long as you make sure they don't kill you, you're just going to get to the point where you can you know, cast Ulamog, attack them twice, and they'll get decked, or maybe not even twice. All right, so we get to see how do I want to sideboard against this deck. So Cage is good against Company. That seems reasonable. The Voracious Hydras might be good. I don't think I want Ratchet Bomb. It seems too slow. This is the matchup that I have Vorinclex in my deck specifically for. Do I want to swap 7-drops? I think Hornet Queen is good. Hornet Queen allows me to block yeah, potentially, you know, a flying Voice of the Blessed or a big Trellisara, something like that. So what don't I want? I don't want Relic of Progenitus. I don't need that. I think I can remove at least one Kogla. Maybe I should just remove both Koglas, and that way I'll be guaranteed to get my Vorinclex. And I'm going to have 4 Voracious Hydras so that they can, you know, fight a lot of the creatures that I need to fight. Am I missing anything? I don't think so. This doesn't have some weird ability that helps me somehow, right? On the draw, I don't have anything to do before turn 4. I think this is pretty clear mulligan. This hand is even worse, but I'm not going to go to 5. I have to imagine that I am in pretty bad shape. Yeah. Though they don't have a creature to play this turn. So maybe I'm not in that bad a shape. I'd just be getting a Hedron Archive. Or I could wait a little bit and I'd be able to get like Nissa next turn. I think I should just get the Hedron Archive and hope that the top of my deck is kind to me. Seems like they're pretty clearly planning to Company. I'll kill the Lunarch Veteran. I guess I can just play the Mind Stone and just do X as 1 to keep my ramping going on. I'm just dead. Oh, they didn't even need to exile the Hydra with the Skyclave Apparition, which was an option they had, but I picked a fight I can't win. And they're going to kill me just with damage. Nice. So that draw was too slow. I kind of knew that when I kept them. We were just hoping that I drew something on turn 1 or 2. Alright, this seems more reasonable. I'll have a fairly fast Ugin. I want to get the Vorinclex. I want to see how Vorinclex performs. I think it's going to perform quite well. Oops. That is unfortunate. So the Lair of the Hydra could be a 4/4 on defense, which is not quite big enough. Really drawn a healthy amount of forests. Is this enough that I'm forced to jump? They have one more creature I'm forced to jump. Can't even jump. They have lethal in the air. Alright. That was a disappointing way to lose. I feel like my deck will let me down in games 2 and 3. So this is one of those hands where I'm glad to have Kazandu Mammoth in my deck. Because I'm definitely going to be interested in playing the Settle. Or my creature's going to die. Fair enough. Come on, no second discard spell. If they don't have a Thoughtseize or another Inquisition, my hand is still quite strong. If they're able to get rid of this second copy of Settle, things are going to start looking kind of grim. Yeah, I was going to say, I'm guessing this is some kind of Rakdos Arcanist deck. Certainly looks like it from the way this started. So if my choices are I can play the Archive and then I can't play the Hydra, and the Hydra will be taken by the Inquisition, or I can just play the Hydra this turn, and that will slow down how quickly we get to Ugin. But I think it's worth just doing this. If they have a Kroxa in their hand, they will be able to get rid of my Ugin, which is kind of annoying. But the upside of just having both archives in play is pretty high. Also, if they have go blank, it's far better that I cast the Hedron Archive. Why didn't they want to attack me for 1? They might have Unholy Heat in their hand, and their plan is like block an Unholy Heat. They also might have Kroxa in their hand, and they just want cards to go to their yard. I guess I'm not going to attack. And I think that I don't want to just add cards into my hand on my own turn, given that they're playing with a lot of discards. So I'm just going to pass. And we'll crack a Hedron Archive and get to have a good turn next turn. Sure, I'll take 1. They clearly have some plan that involves me animating my Faceless Haven. So there's not a need to do that. There's no need to just play into what they want me to do. It's probably just that they have Unholy Heat, and now they've drawn the Fabled Passage, which means that they can make the Unholy Heat kill the Faceless Haven on its own. I think now I'm willing, if they want to attack into me, I'm just going to bait out the Unholy Heat. If what they have is Kroxa, they won't be able to get all of my cards, even if they draw land, because I'll just crack a Mind Stone to put a card back in my hand. Seasoned Pyromancer, sure. So there's the Unholy Heat I knew about. It might not have been a good attack by the opponent, because now I think I'm fairly comfortable just going Ugin plus shoot the Seasoned Pyromancer rather than minusing. And I'm still going to have a Faceless Haven to potentially block this Elemental token. Not that the Elemental token is going to be able to attack Ugin to death, but I do want to keep the loyalty as high as I possibly can. Oh no, they actually have a way to kill that. I was not expecting the Bloodchief's Thirst. I'm just going to sack the Mind Stone. I guess I could have not attacked, and I could have had the option to give this thing indestructible. It's so much mana to do that, though. I will be able to attack into the Kroxa with the option of giving my guy indestructible. Or are they actually killing the Kogla? It's actually really good for me that they're blocking, because having a second Kogla is actually kind of awkward, because you have to choose which one to keep with the legend rule. So if you want the Kogla to fight, you have to have that one be the one that you're keeping. Meaning that you legend rule away one of your Koglas, and then the other Kogla would be a 7/6 fighting a 6/6, so you would just be left with no Koglas at the end of everything. We'd be experiencing an extreme Kogla shortage at that point. Goodbye, Ugin. Didn't really occur to me they were going to block like that. Maybe I should have sent the Lair of the Hydra in instead. Sorin the Merciless. I'm just not making it easy on me. My draw steps also really aren't making it very easy on me. I'm threatening to just animate the Lair of the Hydra and block with it. Sadly, I really do need to draw something, though, because Kogla is going to be spending a lot of time trying to attack through these Seasoned Pyromancer tokens that are coming. Can't do both in one turn, but they can do... two tokens each turn for the next 2 turns. So I want to make this an 8/8, I guess. Might have Unholy Heat here. That wouldn't be that bad for me, though. if they bring back Kroxa again here, like if they kill the Lair of the Hydra, bring back Kroxa, I'm still going to have the Kogla and Faceless Haven, and they'll be harder pressed to block. All right, another Kogla down, but they'd be forced to chump the Sorin. Or they'd be forced to chump the Kroxa if they want to keep the Sorin alive this turn, so that's good for me. I think it's definitely worth killing the Sorin here. You might look and say, okay, their life total's 12. If I just attack with the Kogla, they're going to go down to 5. And so then the next turn the Kogla will be lethal. But remember, next turn they can just -2 to get a 2/3 vampire that will chump for a turn. So I actually deal less damage to my opponent if I don't kill the Sorin that turn. I'll just pick off a 1/1 here. I go to 4. This game isn't working out the way I was hoping it would. All right, that's a good draw. Is there any reason not to just make it a 8/9 and kill this thing? I'll be attacked by 2 elemental tokens and a goblin and the Den of the Bugbear. So 4 attackers. Yeah. Maybe I should attack them. Because if they don't block, then the Voracious Hydra would be lethal next turn. Oh, I could have made it for 9. I always forget about the Castle Garenbrig. And that actually makes a fair amount of difference because now Faceless Haven can't contribute to being a lethal attacker. Against this deck, I definitely want the Cage. I think I want the Scavenging Ooze. Do I want Koglas or Carnage Tyrants? Carnage Tyrant kind of seems better. It feels like the Kogla is like I'm not going to get to fight and kill something all that often. Let's try that swap. And I think Pelakka Wurm is going to be better than Hornet Queen, maybe. Do I want more Voracious Hydras or do I just want none? I think I want none. So now if they get a Kroxa into play, the only way to get it off the board is Ugin or Ulamog or blocking it. But I've got 4 cards that are going to be fighting against them getting a Kroxa out. Let's try this. I guess I also have the 1 Blast Zone that could get the Kroxa off the board. Wasn't thinking that they had these in their deck. Sometimes the black-red decks don't play this card anymore. My deck, the way it's currently configured, is soft to flying. So I boarded out all of my things that could effectively fight this card. I think if I'd known that they had the Dragon's Rage Channelers, I would have left the Koglas in over the Carnage Tyrants. But no need to fear. I've got the Pelakka Wurm. That'll gain me enough life. This style of ramping with artifacts is extremely vulnerable to Kolaghan's command, sadly. I don't think there's any way around it. Just if you draw a hand like this and they draw 2 copies of Kolaghan's command, you're just going to lose. I would assume they're taking Ugin here. Maybe they want to take the Pelakka Wurm. So they're up to 4 cards. Why didn't they do this before they attacked? You could very easily deal 2 extra damage, potentially. Should I block? Certainly not. If I blocked, they would just be able to play Kroxa. Even if I blocked and it worked, they would just play Kroxa for their turn, so that's not desirable at all. I kind of think I'm going to get Kolaghan's commanded here. They scried to the top. They didn't do anything, but they didn't play Kolaghan's command. Interesting. Do I want a Faceless Haven or just a Snow-Covered Forest? Probably a Snow-Covered Forest. It taps for 2 mana with the Nissa out, and I just don't even have enough forests for Snow-Covered Forests to activate a Faceless Haven. I messed up in how I tapped my mana. I should have been able to have this land untapped. Not sure it hurt me that much, though, given that they could have just made a Kroxa anyway. Now, I'm going to play the land. Sure. So I could attack them for 9 and put them to 4. But then they would have a Kroxa. I could attack them for, I guess 6 is probably the best total. And then this way I'll be able to crack the Hedron Archive to hopefully draw into something that does something. If I had attacked them to 9 and they had gone down to 4, I wouldn't really have been threatening lethal because they would have just chumped the next layer of the Hydra attack with a Goblin token, so it wouldn't have done anything. A little bit late there, Scavenging Ooze. A little bit late. So I think my plan here is if they attack with Kroxa, I'm going to double block with my land and the Scavenging Ooze. And I'll just make the Scavenging Ooze up to 4/4. With, I think I have 2 Llanowar Elves and a Pelakka Wurm in my graveyard. Yeah. They don't have anything, but I'll be able to also eat their Den of the Bugbear. If they have a removal spell, it's kind of doomed for me here. You have to draw an Ugin or an Ulamog. Carnage Tyrant wouldn't be bad either. Land. Land's probably not what I wanted. Doesn't seem worth attacking. They would just double block with the Seasoned Pyromancer and a token. They probably can't afford to attack with the Hive of the Eye Tyrant. I guess the thing they can afford to do, which is going to be really bad for me, is they can just start using Castle Lochthwain. Opponent disagrees. I guess I need to block that. I think the opponent was right. I think that this is a good attack. Sorcery, sorcery, land, creature. Ow. That reduced my life total and hurt my feelings. Not sure I understand why they're doing this play. I guess they're planning to just make a bunch of tokens on the ground. I think this attack would have made sense if they hadn't started their turn out by playing Bonecrusher Giant. But I guess they know their top cards, so maybe they know it's something that makes this make sense. So my plan is block and eat, block and trade, charge up the blast zone, or just die. Die also works. All right, so now my plan is jump and hope the top deck Ugin. I still die even if that happens. The Den of the Bugbear kills me, I think, regardless of what I draw. I'm fine keeping a hand like this. If they have a card that kills my Llanowar Elves and I don't draw a land, it's obviously going to be bad. But if they don't have a card that kills my Llanowar Elves, this hand is going to wind up being extremely good. I am now realizing, though, that I forgot to take out the Carnage Tyrants for the Koglas again. One thing about mulliganing in Historic, when you play against one of these decks that's just full of discard spells, mulliganing is really not conducive to winning. You're just making their Thoughtseizes that much more effective if you start down a card or two. Yeah, I guess I'll sack this. It's unfortunate I didn't draw a land that turn. Probably my elf is going to live here. It looks like it's not going to live. I'm kind of surprised. Oh, okay. They didn't have Unholy Heat. They just had a 2-mana way to kill it. That's why they didn't kill it turn 1. This card is just so good. So I'm going to get to go Mindstone, Settle, get new Nissa this way. Seems fine. Definitely scared about this Croxa and the Den of the Bugbear. It's potentially going to put a hole in Nissa's loyalty total at some point. Assuming they're able to kill the first land I turn into a creature. Also, it wouldn't be crazy if they were just able to make me discard the Nissa this turn. Okay. Their hand's probably pretty bad if that's what they're doing. I don't want to cast the Explore here because it taps this thing that I'm going to be using to block the forest. Even though they can potentially kill the forest, they'd have to have a really specific hand to be able to kill the forest and animate the Den of the Bugbear. Yeah, by specific hand, they'd need to have probably Fatal Push in their hand. It's the only way they'd be able to do it. They don't have Delirium yet. And also, if they had Delirium on an Unholy Heat, they'd just be able to kill the Nissa outright. So I can't really play around that very effectively. So Crocs is still a little bit delayed. That's good for me. The Seasoned Pyromancer, where you're just playing it to draw 2 cards, is quite a nice card. I was making a list of what cards I was hoping to draw that turn. 3 lands in a row would not have been on it. At 4 cards right now in the yard. I think I have enough mana to activate the Lair of the Hydra that I don't need to do it quite yet. I get to see what they're going to do with the rest of their turn. I guess I'm getting they're getting at Kroxa if I block here. I think I'm okay with that. Classic face-off, Kroxa versus Nissa. I could just let the Nissa, if they attack the Kroxa into the Nissa, I could just let the Nissa lose loyalty. It's not that big of a deal. Could also just chump with the Llanowar Elves. Or I could animate the Lair of the Hydra and try to block. I guess I like that best. This forces them to use whatever they have. I don't really expect that I'm going to get to block here. I expect that they're going to play some card that does, you know, something that saves their guy. And then the Nissa is going to take 6, or I'm going to decide to chump block. I don't know if they didn't see that, or that was just a bluff that didn't work. Either way, I'm glad I blocked. All right, that's it for me for today. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you're interested in this deck, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I think this deck has potential for sure. This is like my second version of building this deck, with the first one I made yesterday and then 1 day's worth of refinements. And it already feels like it's fairly competitive against the good historic decks. Like the 2 decks I played against today, Heliod, that's a top tier deck, and the Black-Red Dreadhorde Arcanist deck, that's another top tier deck. And in both matchups, I felt like my cards were at the right power level for fighting what my opponent was doing. And they certainly had some cards that were annoying for me to deal with, but also from my, you know, from the other side, I had some cards that were extremely good in the matchups too. So I think that this could be an actual contender for a competitive historic deck, which is pretty exciting. So that's it for me for today, and please remember to subscribe if you haven't already. It does help the channel out, and I appreciate it.